So yeah, we've got Raphael Chikukwa, who's a Museum of Modern Art, International Curatorial Institute Center for Curatorial Leadership, quite a title, 2021 Fellow. Before becoming the Executive Director and Chief Curator of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, he worked mainly as an independent curator over 10 years. He was the founding curator of the Zimbabwean Pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennale in 2011, and I believe after the conference is headed there for this year's rendition. Recently appointed head of the National Art Institution, he envisages to change the visual arts landscape of Zimbabwe. So Raphael will be speaking to us about some pioneers of Zimbabwean art, and I will hand over to you. Do you have a presentation?
Thank you very much, Portia. I would also want to thank the organizers for bringing us over here once again. This is also a very special place for the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, because our founding director, Frank McEwen, was working here before he was appointed to be the executive director of the Rhodes National Gallery then. And so basically, when Portia introduced the topic, was examining the pioneers of the Zimbabwean art scene, but I decided to change that because I don't know, when people are talking about the pioneers, whose pioneers are we talking about, and from which perspective are we talking about? So I decided to call my paper Returning to the Early Conversations from the Natives to the Global Art Stage. It's also because going through the archive of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe just before, when the invitation came to the National Gallery and to me by Riason Naidoo and Elsa, I was digging through the archive of the National Gallery and Frank McEwen, and I came across the original plans of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. And in those original plans, there was one room which was entitled Natives Changing Rooms. And here I'm talking about the way we were called once upon a time as natives. And when Frank McEwen was appointed to be the director of the National Gallery in the 50s, when he moved to the National Gallery, to Rhodes then, he foresaw the construction of the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, which is one of the most beautiful architecture buildings in Zimbabwe. And but before he arrived there were other art schools that have been surviving. The other art schools that includes Tengenenge, that includes Cyrene, which was founded in 1940s by Canon Patterson. Canon Patterson was a Scottish missionary who belonged to the Church of England. So the Cyrene Art Center nurtured a number of artists that includes Kingsley Sambo, that includes the likes of Dube, who later won a scholarship for him to go and study at Makerere University or the School of Art, which was founded by Margaret Throwell. So it was later during that federation that he could not go. Then later on you had also another art school which was founded by a Swiss architect, a Swiss missionary by the name of Hans Gruber. Hans Gruber was a Catholic missionary at Serima, and later on founded that Serima mission as an art school. And some of the artists that came out of the art school included the likes of Nicholas Mkomberanwa and many others. But here I want to focus on the generation that was founded by two special people that include Frank McEwen and Tom Blumenfeld. Frank McEwen decided to start an art school which was entitled the Workshop School, just behind the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. So it was in this group that the likes of Nicholas Mkomberanwa, Joram Mariga, and many others were part and parcel of that art school, the Workshop School that was behind the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. But further, to about 165 kilometers away from Harare, there was Tom Bloomfield, who was a tobacco farmer, because when Ian Smith declared the UDI, which was called the Declaration of Independence, United Declaration of Independence, unilateral declaration of independence, it meant that Zimbabwe was under sanctions. Rhodesia, by then, was under sanctions. So tobacco was no longer profitable to the community of Zimbabwe. So Tom Bloomfield, as a tobacco farmer, he had encountered the likes of Joram Mariga within the Great Dike, who were sculpting, and started the Tengenenge Community Art Center. It is then, the Tengenenge, it's a Kore word that means the beginning of the beginning. So with Joram Mariga and some of the artists who became the artists, most of them were from gardeners, cooks, tobacco graders, especially the likes of Bernard Matemera, who is one of the famous Zimbabwean sculptor, was a tobacco grader. Lemon Moses was Tom Bloomfield's cook, and Henry Munyaradzi was a gardener at Tengenenge. So these are some of the artists that came out of the Tengenenge Community Art Center. But all these artists were now coined into the so-called Shona sculptors, or Shona artists, which most of these artists are known throughout the world as Shona artists. But I would like to say there is a need for us to revisit this terminology, because it was a term which was coined during the colonial era. I was talking with colleagues earlier on that I'm not Shona, I'm Zezuru, and some of these artists came as far as Angola, Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and you're the likes of Tubai Dube, who is Ndebele. So coining them as Shona artists is something which I think us as new scholars, we need to revisit that terminology, because it's very, it's kind of misinforming us as a community, because the colonial government bundled all Zimbabwean people as Shona. It's just as good as bundling all the South Africans as Zulus. And my sister here, she's not Zulu, but South African from the other region. So it meant that a number of people were being marginalized, but there's a need for us to rethink and maybe call this movement Zimbabwean sculptors. But it is important to note that before Frank McEwen and Tom Bloomfield arrived in Zimbabwe, the tradition of art has always existed. And this is evident with the Great Zimbabwe ruins. It's evident in the rock paintings that is dotted around Southern Africa. And I know that the rock paintings within Southern Africa are some of the oldest rock paintings in the world. So when Frank McEwen arrived, he had thought that there was no art tradition in Zimbabwe. And the people of Zimbabwe did not know how to paint. And some of these people, Sylvester Mbai, Nicholas Mkomberanwa, Joram Mariga, Bernard Takawira, these were some of the artists. They worked at the National Gallery as gallery attendants. They were not artists. And then later on, he decided to give them paint brushes, chisels, and hammers for them. During their lunch hour, they would start sculpting behind. But on the other side, you had the likes of Tom Bloomfield with his movement from 1965 onwards. And that movement then was the supply point where sculptures were being transported from Tengenenge in Mashonaland Central to the National Gallery. But the marriage between the two also was in a rocky state at some point, and Tom Bloomfield decided not to send sculptures to the National Gallery. But already, the likes of Sylvester Mbai had also struck a relationship with Frank McEwen. So they moved to the workshop school. It was in 1962 when Frank McEwen hosted the International Congress on African Cultures. And it was then, in 1962, that the likes of some of the artists from within the continent were showcased and came to attend the conference. Vincent Kofi from Ghana. You had Selby Mvusi from South Africa. You also had the likes of Dr. Biabaku, who was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ife in Nigeria. Roland Penrose from ICI, the United Kingdom. You also had the likes of Alfred Barr, who was the MoMA director. All these people came to attend the conference, and others came as far as France, here in Paris, Toulouse, Netherlands, Germany, and Ivory Coast, and Ghana, because Vincent Kofi was originally from Ghana, who also attended the conference. It was at that conference that a number of American visitors, that includes Alfred Barr, were attracted by the so-called Shona art. And the artists like Thomas Mukarobwa, Kingsley Sambo, they were then collected by the MoMA director, and they become part and parcel of the MoMA collection in 1962. But the likes of Sylvester Mbai's work was very, very much attracted by a number of collectors who then wanted to take Sylvester Mbai to America. And it was then that Frank McEwen resorted to move the art school, the workshop school, from the National Gallery to about 200 kilometers away from Harare, which they started the Vukutu studio. And the Vukutu studio was far away in the bush in Nyanga on the way to Mozambique. So it was a way to hide these artists from the other collectors who were very much interested in relocating some of these artists into the United States of America. And Sylvester Mbai is one of the artists we showcased at the Venice Biennale a few years ago. It was a way to celebrate his contribution to the Zimbabwean art scene, but also to remind the new generation of artists that people like Sylvester Mbai, Nicholas Mkomberanwa, Bernard Matemera, and many others paved the way for us to be where we are. And their work is still relevant to the Zimbabwean art scene and to the international art scene. But these artists showcased their work. In 1971, Zimbabwean work arrives in Paris at the Rodin Museum, and these works include the works by artists like Paul Guichiri, Lazarus Takawira, Bernard Takawira, Joseph Ndandarika, Kingsley Sambo, and many others. And later on, some of these artists were also showcased at MoMA. They were showcased at the ICI in London. They were showcased at the Commonwealth Institute in the United Kingdom. And it was then that all these artists' work, today, it is celebrated in Zimbabwe and abroad as Shona sculpture or Shona art. And we now have galleries dotted around Europe which are dedicated to the same movement. But it's mainly sculpture. The likes of Kingsley Sambo, Charles Fernandez, and Thomas Moore, they were part and parcel of the great painters that really are part of the Zimbabwean modernist art movement. But I would like to say the survival of Tengenenge is something which is very special, because Tom Bloomfield, who died 2 years ago, made sure that the movement keeps surviving. And today, Tengenenge artists, when I was appointed as the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, I made it a point to see that there's a need for us to purchase Tengenenge Community Art Center because it was up for the grab. And there were many Western galleries who were very much interested in taking over the center. But in our wisdom as National Gallery, we had to take over Tengenenge Community Art Center. And today, Tengenenge has got more than 200 artists. And it's a movement that is very important by shaping the Zimbabwean contemporary art and the Zimbabwe modern art, that the need for it to retain its status is very important, because sculpture movement at the National Gallery of Zimbabwe is something which is well documented. We're still going through the archive that was left by Frank McEwen, also going through the archive that was left by Tom Blumenfeld. And Frank McEwen was fired by Ian Smith in 1973. And then he sailed back to United Kingdom and settled in Oxford. And later on, he died. And his archive that he carried when he left Rhodesia has been donated to the Oxford University, which we are also still going to see to it that maybe we can lay our hands into that archive. But I would like to say one of the most important things that Frank McEwen did was the idea of the International Congress on African Cultures. We are told that the idea was mooted here in Paris, but it was later realized in Rhodesia in 1962. They tried to do a publication of the proceedings, but unfortunately, we only have a few dummy copies, which we have managed to digitalize about all the proceedings. The conversations between Selby Mvusi, the heated conversation between Selby Mvusi and Alfred Barr, it's well documented, both audiovisual and in print, that we have managed to digitalize, and we are looking forward to share with other scholars who are interested. But I would like to celebrate Frank McEwen in so many ways, because he was able to purchase some of the very most important modernist artists. That includes Selby Mvusi from South Africa, Blade Glover from Ghana, Ben Anwenwi from Nigeria. We've got a very powerful and beautiful sculpture from Ben Anwenwi. And we also have a collection of the likes of David Koloane, Malangatana, Lionel Davis, and many other African artists that are in the collection. Which brings us to a discussion, maybe to a question which Chris raised, the politics of the stomach, that causes many artists to mass produce some of their work. But the politics of the stomach is something which the rest of the continent is still battling with. And Zimbabwe is not immune to the politics of stomach. But the sad chapter we have today is some of our artists are collected mostly abroad, but not in the continent. And it's one of those strategies, I think, as African art institutions, we need to look into, and to look at possibilities of growing our own art ecosystem. Museums in the continent today are facing huge challenges, both from East to West Africa to Southern Africa, and the National Gallery is not immune to those challenges. But I'm sure there is a need for us to rethink the ways and means we collect, and the ways and means that we can keep these institutions relevant to the new generation of artists, scholars, so much that the future generation have got something to look at. And what the two brothers, Sylvester Obechi and Chris, were raising, some of the key issues that when you're looking at publishing and looking at the archive that the National Gallery has, and many archives that are dotted around with the Rocker Street Art Center, the Makerere School of Art, which was founded by Margaret Trowell, with the likes of Jack Katarikawe and Teresa Msoke and others. Those archives are still existing in those schools, both in East Africa, Southern Africa, the Rocker Street Art Center, and the Poly Street in South Africa. But when you try to look for funding to valorize these archives and those that came before us, I'm sure we have done a book which is called The Insight of Zimbabwean Art, and we published with Keba, which is a German publishing house. Sometimes we lose our archives and they're owned, the copyright, with the international publishing house. But I think it is important for us as African scholars to look at the possibilities of how we can publish locally, if it means a black and white publication that can remain as an archive. It will be very, very important for the next generation. And why am I saying this? I will repeat, because we cannot continue to remain passengers in our own ship. Those archives, collections outside the African continent, it is time we lay our hands on them, giving them our own perspectives, giving them our own narratives. For those that came before us, some of them are still alive, and those that have passed on, there's a need for us to revisit. Because the likes of Sylvester Mbai, Enos Gunja, who are called Shona sculptors, in which a terminology which I don't believe in, because a lot of these artists came from different walks of lives. But to call them, to assimilate them to be called Zimbabwean artists is something which I think is very important. The Tengenenge Art Community Center, for it to go beyond, it is us and it's none but ourselves that can make this history relevant. And currently we are also inviting young scholars and researchers to revisit the archive that has been left by Frank McEwen, because it's still intact. And I'm glad to say that the processes of digitalization, it's one of the processes that we have started. And it is important for our middle class in the continent to see how we can grow our own art ecosystem. When I look at Nigeria and South Africa, these are the two giants in the continent. There's a number of middle class between Johannesburg and Lagos, Abuja and Cape Town, and also what the other collectives that are coming through in the continent, from the Zoma contemporary art in Ethiopia, in Addis, to what is coming out of Uganda and what is coming out of Nairobi, and the CCA Lagos that was founded by our late sister, Bisi. It remains another inspiration, and also the other center, the Douala Art Center, that is in Douala in Cameroon. When I look at all those centers, it's a reminder to say the possibilities are endless in the continent of Africa. But it's us that can unite to make it possible. It's us that we can also educate the middle class and the political elite so much that they can understand the role and function of the archives and the contributions of those that came before us, and especially the movements that have come possibly through the missionary interventions like the Lutheran Church in South Africa, the Margaret Trowell School of Art in Uganda, and the Uli Bias contribution and Susan Wenger in Nigeria. So I think together as one, we can make a difference. And like what Chris said, a tree does not make a forest, but it is many trees that can make a forest. And we are here, organize this conference, thanks to Riason and the Institute here to organize, but we are constantly always here, and we are constantly organized to deliberate more about African art in the West, more here than it is in the continent. But it's high time for us to be able to do this also in the African soil and to educate the young scholars in the African soil, because we are always thinking locally instead of thinking continentally, and instead of thinking how we can have Africa to Africa connections. The Dakar Biennale has played that role. The Bamako Biennale has played that role. The death of the Johannesburg Biennale reminds us of so many possibilities, but the birth of the Joburg Art Fair and the Cape Town Art Fair has also brought a hope to the continent. And now we have the Lagos Art Fair, ArtX Lagos, and other interventions, including the Kampala Biennale and the 154. So with those words, I would like to say, Asante Sana, thank you, Siyabonga, and it is our hope and my hope that next time we will meet in the continent more often than we are meeting in Africa, and there are African brothers and sisters here, that we meet more here than we meet in Harare, than we meet in Nairobi, than we meet in Lagos or in Kampala. When the French president spoke about the issues of celebrating Africa in Africa when he was in Ouagadougou, it's a reminder to us that we are not celebrating Africa in Africa. That does it need the French president to say we must celebrate Africa in Africa? But I think there is need for us to be able to be more organized as a continent and be able to celebrate Africa in Africa. Ngiyabonga. Tatenda.
Thank you so much for that. As you were talking, I was wondering if we do indeed not gather in the ways that we should be gathering, or maybe some smaller gatherings are happening, but not in the way that they're happening here, largely because of resources, quite possibly. But thank you so much, Raphael. You provided us with a lot of beautiful nuggets to sort of contemplate and think around. And what struck me were quite a few things, but this idea of collecting anxiety. In South Africa, what happens in museum culture at a particular moment in time is that public institutions, white-run public institutions, start to realize that they don't have works by black artists, right? So there becomes this moment where they go out and they just constantly just purchase an abundance of work and position them within the collection. So when you're talking about how the National Gallery in Zimbabwe actually has works by Koloane and Davis and others across the continent, I was thinking that South African institutions, and I stand corrected here, don't actually have works by modernists across the continent. But I think a trend is actually starting to develop now, when the anxiety of, oh God, we don't have, oh God, we don't have this representation, and then now the need to try and fill that gap through this collecting anxiety. It's starting to happen in very interesting ways. And the other thing that you spoke about that struck me was around ideas of access, and where Black and African archives actually are located, and how we don't actually have access to them. So there's this lens of this loss of ownership, and ideas of who becomes the custodian of Black archives becomes quite, I was going to say interesting, but it's more sad than anything. But with that, I think I'll open up to the audience if there are any questions, comments, feedback. Mario, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Raphael. I just wanted to make a comment. It's really, I think, quite heartening for me to hear you taking the kind of approach you are taking to, you know, what's the legacy of a Frank McEwen, of a Tom Blumenfeld, because, I mean, you will know even better than I that there's a general tendency to caricature these figures. Uli Bayer, Margaret Trowell, etc. These people are obviously not without fault, and paternalism was part of the culture at the time, etc. But they tend to not get historicized. They tend to be written as if they are the same person. And along with that comes this dismissal of, like you're saying, you know, the opportunities that were created for somebody who, under colonialism, had now found themselves working in a tobacco farm or whatever, and now suddenly is given a chance to carve. I mean, you know how many writers have written stuff that is so dismissive of that. It's like, you know, these cooks, these gardeners that, you know, suddenly, you know, geniuses, etc. I mean, you know that discourse. It's a kind of, I find it a discourse that actually really caricatures historical situations. So, you know, not to romanticize these figures again, but you know, to actually have a balanced and critical historicized perspective. So I just think it's very interesting to see you taking that approach when it's quite dangerous for you in a way, because maybe dangerous is a bit strong, but you know, there's such a tendency to dismiss these figures. So in a way, you're sticking your neck out. So I just want to compliment you for doing that. And I mean, you're making the argument well. So certainly you have my support.
Well, I mean, it's at first when I arrived at the National Gallery, you know, before you work at the, you don't have access to the archive, and being at the National Gallery, you realize what has been left there, that there's a need for us to interrogate and question some of what Frank McEwen and others had ideas about how to grow the Zimbabwean art scene. I'm sure there's the Central African magazine, which is, it's called the Central African Examiner, where Frank McEwen, in the beginning, he had no belief that there was an art tradition in Zimbabwe. So when you read Frank McEwen from the beginning, you understand that later on, it was at the International Congress on African Culture that he talked about African art inspiring the European modernism. So it is that confession that you understand that later on, when he was in the middle of being in Rhodesia and his contact with Picasso, his contact with Senghor and many others, he realized the contribution of Africa to the European modernism. So when you look at that archive, when you go through the archive, you also see the need for us to put it out there for others to contribute to his legacy. But not only that, and those who have been to Zimbabwe, the National Gallery is one of the iconic buildings in the country. It's a modernist architecture and very special. And it is up to us to revisit its past and interrogate it. And why I talked about the natives, it's also because it's in the original plans of the National Gallery. There's a Mrs. Brown letter which talked about the first exhibition that arrived at the National Gallery in 1957, which was entitled From Rembrandt to Picasso. The biggest ever European masters exhibition to travel to the continent. And Mrs. Brown, when she visited, because she lived just opposite the National Gallery at Trafalgar Court. And it's a letter which I came across when I was going through the archive. She said, walking through the exhibition was very good, but the very disturbing thing was the shouting of the African voices of the gallery attendants. So she wrote a complaint letter to the director, who was Frank McEwen. So when you look at that, you realize what was happening at the National Gallery. Then you also come across when Frank McEwen was appointed as the director. I'm sure it was Mr. Pennywise who wrote a very critical letter in the newspaper, and I've donated a book to this institute, which backdates from newspaper cuttings from 1957 to 2017, when the gallery celebrated 60 years. So it is in that newspaper cutting that I came across Mr. Penrose, who was very critical about Frank McEwen and saying the idea of the National Gallery is not a good idea. The first idea was to build an art school before you build the gallery. But Frank McEwen took it lightly, but developed later on, started an art school, which was the workshop school behind the National Gallery. So that's the very interesting that when you look at the archive, when you go through it, you realize that there were, when you become a director of an institution, there will be very critical voices, but those critical voices are very important because they informs your thinking. There were others who were very critical from Bulawayo about why the National Gallery in Harare. But it was later, in the 1970s, the National Gallery opened in Bulawayo. So it is those critical voices that can inform your thinking and can make your life much easier as a director.
Yeah, I mean, I find it quite interesting that when you did acknowledge, obviously, the contribution of McEwen collecting or having the impetus to actually collect works from across the continent, it's obviously something to be commendable, but I wonder if it should delete the skepticism that that people generally have with discussing these figures in this sort of messianic role. I think because of the structures that allow them to actually occupy that space, that does not allow others to occupy that space. So yeah. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, shame. I'll take one more question. He hasn't had any questions.
Sure, question. Thank you. I love Zimbabwe, by the way. It's gorgeous. In the schools, for example, do you think, or do you have, in the curriculum, for example, in the high schools, lycée, is there anything related in the curriculum talking about the importance of collecting archives for the country? Is there anything that's happening?
It's in the universities, yes.
But in the lycée, but not the universities, but the lower schools?
No.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, that was short and quick. I'll take another one. Short, yeah.
Excuse me, a very short question, because when I heard Raphael talking about this museum, I think about my museum, Theodore Monod Museum of African Art, and I'm asking if there is any kind of job you are making about approaching, having a critical approach of colonial archives in museum regarding this kind of archive you find in the National Museum of Zimbabwe.
I'm sure I would like to say this is an approach that we are thinking, to invite other scholars to look at this archive because it's there, to be able to look at it critically from their own perspectives. And as much as I have my own thinking about the archive, but it's good to have other voices. But like what Portia has just said, the funding becomes a limiting factor because you cannot invite maybe you, Ndiaye, as a scholar, maybe Thembi or Riason, is to be able to put some funding together for that residency and then have those voices, especially, let's say, I want to look at the archive of Thembinkosi, a good example, who is a South African modernist painter. I mean, the archive we have is from his works and some of the letters between him and Frank Makiwe and his conversation with Alfred Barr. But it's something which we are currently trying to collaborate with another museum, which is the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But there's more to do with our own African art institutions for us to combine these researches within the continent, which I think co-funding these projects would benefit the African scholar in the continent. And we are bound to go to MoMA because they have the funds. But I would be very much more inclined to actually engage more African art institutions or universities to be able to do this and to co-fund so that the archive remains relevant to the African students and to the future generation.
So we'll be moving on to Thembinkosi's paper on David Koloane and Thupelo workshop, and on the Thupelo workshop. So Thembinkosi Goniwe is an artist and art historian whose work explores contemporary African visual arts, post-colonial criticism, and Black radical thought. His artworks have been exhibited locally and internationally. He has contributed essays to various publications and has curated exhibitions in South Africa, the United States, Venice, and Edinburgh. Trained in fine art at the University of Cape Town and in history of art at Cornell University, Goniwe has taught at various South African universities and is currently lecturer in art history and visual culture at Rhodes University in Grahamstown. So Goniwe will speak for half an hour, and I'll crack the whip when time is up. Yeah.
Thank you, Portia, and thank you for the invitation. I would like to appreciate Riason, Elsa, and Mari for the work they've done organizing my trip coming here. And my participation here is shaped by Riason's request that I speak on David Koloane's work, in particular the Thupelo workshop. That's why I've posted this image, because he was interested in my thoughts of the exhibition I did in 2019, a retrospective of David Koloane, which took place in Cape Town and then moved to Johannesburg. So the title of it is A Resilient Visionary, Poetic Expression of David Koloane. So what I'm going to do here is to discuss the idea of the Thupelo. But what I've sought to do is to rather stay within the abstract. Unlike my beautiful colleagues who've been discussing images. I'm interested in this project for two reasons. One of them is always thought as a workshop, and it starts there, it ends there. And I've come to read this limited thinking of this project as a workshop. So then my second thought is to ask, what else can we do with this idea of the workshop? That's why the title itself, The Last Modernism Project in South Africa. It is not colon. I think there was a re-editing of my title. The title is The Last Modernism Project in South Africa is David Koloane's Thupelo workshop. So that basically is the thesis in which I'll want to argue. So to start, I'll read and also I'll speak, because sometimes when I read, I get bored. So I'll keep talking in between. In this presentation, I discussed the contribution of the late artist David Koloane to the project of modernism in South Africa and the southern parts of Africa. The specific contribution I want to discuss is the formation and benefits of the Thupelo workshop that began in 1985 in Johannesburg, and in the 90s onwards, the workshop moved to Cape Town. My focus is on the 80s, a crucial decade in the history of ending the political apartheid and eventually the bringing into effect the democracy that South Africa has been celebrated for in the 90s and today, as flawed as it is. So it is the 80s I want to focus, because it's a very interesting context in which Thupelo was conceived. So what it is that is important about the 80s, it's the last decade that forced apartheid to begin to enter negotiation with political organization because of internal pressure as well as external pressures. So I won't go to those details. Of course, there are events that are important for us just to note. The formation of the United Democratic Front, the formation of COSATU, the two-state of emergencies, and the riot. Some of us were part as students. We lost 2 years in that decade, but here we are. Of course, during that time, we lost a lot of people, in particular black people. Some were arrested and some were killed. And of course, there were also casualties among the white population. And Thupelo is born out of this context. And one of its recognition is to have brought what you call it, abstraction, in particular for black artists. But this is also a misunderstanding of the history of South African art. Abstraction among black artists didn't start with Thupelo. Already, there were artists who were working with abstract forms. I'll mention just two beside Mangoba, who started his abstraction work in Europe. Artists like Louis Maqhubela were already working with forms of abstraction, non-figurative art. But what has become common in the history of black art in South Africa is this staple dose of figurative art and this social realism, to the extent that it at times is confused with the condemned art called township art. And at times, some of those images are also subjected to what is known as protest art or as resistance art or as commentary art and so forth. So the diversity, the dynamics of creative productions by black artists tends to be reduced into these so-called categories. Another category that is important, which also defined the 80s, which of course started earlier in the 70s, even 60s if we trace it, the idea of art as a weapon of the struggle or as a cultural tool in the fight against apartheid. So what you get at times is that black artists are not given individual attention. There's a tendency not to pay attention to their specific works because of these categories. So what Thupelo does when it was introduced as a two-week workshop where artists were invited to work in isolation, where they were given an opportunity to experiment, to kind of work away from the routines of their solitude or of the everyday kind of distraction of their communities and so forth, to be given an opportunity where they can experiment, explore. The purpose was to search for new forms, new expression. The format in which the Thupelo is known for is artists arrive, they are given materials, but also they look around and recycle found object. And at times they invent things. So, and also there are discussion between artists, among artists, and also they invite a critic who will also discuss with individual artists, but sometimes in group. So it is this forum. David calls it a pressure cooker, right, where artists are forced to focus and try and discover new ways. And this has been praised for the kind of work that came out of that, especially the non-figurative work as well as other forms of abstraction. But it's not true that that's the only work. Some of the work, they remain within the realm of social realism, and some, they still abstracted the figure in different way. But what I'm not going to do here, as I said, is to discuss images. I'm more interested in this man. How do I move this thing? So that's the title, right? So this is the man I'm interested in, because he is central in this project. But of course, David has collaborated with a number of individuals in working with Thupelo, but it is the story I'm interested in. And the story of David is that David and Bill Ainslie, of course, via Bill Ainslie, they met the British sculptor, Sir Anthony Caro, who happened to be in South Africa in the early 80s. And Caro went to visit the Fuba, and he saw the condition, then they discussed. And then David was invited, together with Bill Ainslie, to go to New York to the Triangle Workshop, which I think at the time was already, 2 years? Because it started in 1982. A similar workshop where artists from Canada, from I think the UK, as well as America, they will work for 2 weeks, similar experimenting and having critiques. So Bill Ainslie arrived earlier, but David came later because of the visa problems at the time. So he came, I think, 3 days later, but he managed to do some work and then engaged. But they invited him the following year to come to the workshop. So when he came back, this is now 84, because they went in 1983. They started the Thupelo workshop in 1985. The story is that it was David, in collaboration with Bill Ainslie and other artists. And this is the kind of common story, and it's an important story. But of course, like all ideas, there's no idea that just 3 people can have it at the same time. An idea is brought by one person, and then that person starts to discuss it with someone else. And then from there, they start to collaborate. So in other words, ideas have originators. It is that I'm interested in. Precisely because when we speak of pioneers, a discussion we had with colleagues, and a sense of anxiety about the idea of pioneer as a concept that is trapped within whether the European language or the artistry content canon. I'm not too concerned about that, because the limits of language will always condition us to the extent that we can work with language. But what I'm interested in is why it matters to begin to attribute certain ideas to particular artists. This is because David is mainly known for the work he has done, such as curating, organizing the workshop, founding the workshop, Thupelo, as well as Back Factory Studios. And you can go back again, he was part of what they call it the first gallery organized by black artists in the late 70s. And David is also appreciated for mentoring artists, for teaching in schools. And of course, for writing about artists and writing criticism about art generally in South Africa, specifically about black issues and black subject. But what you don't find, about David is that there hasn't been a single scholarly essay about David prior 2019, when I was doing the exhibition. And that I found it curious why this man that has done so much and has been praised, has been given honorary doctorate, 3 of them, and yet you cannot find even a monograph on him, let alone an academic essay, whether it's in a journal or in some of the major publications on art, both locally and internationally. But what you'll get is always written in essays or reviews that involved a number of artists. So that's why it became interesting for me that I have to begin now to zoom into his project. Then I started to enter conversations with him, similar in the way Portia was talking about her engagement with Helen. One of the stories he tells me that during one of those trips when he was in New York, that's how Thupelo starts. He stayed after the workshop and spent time with the African-American sculptor Peter Bradley. This is where the idea of the workshop began, about how to bring the workshop to South Africa. And of course, when David came back, he discussed the idea with Bill. Bill was already a friend and a collaborator with David, and that's where the idea started. But under those circumstances, it was difficult for David to set a workshop because of resources. Given that to be black, in those days, it's hard to find money, to find resources. So that's why Bill was handy. That's why you'll find always David tends to stand not next to Bill, but as a shadow to Bill, even when the idea is his. So it is that we need to clear, that kind of cloud, so that David can stand either next to Bill or in front of Bill, and many others, so that he can enter history, of art and visual arts as an individual that has pioneered this kind of project. So the second point I want to make is that similar when David, the Back Factory was formed, David again received a scholarship facilitated by Anthony Caro and Robert Lothar to study in the UK, in London. So when he was there, he reconnected with some of the artists he participated with in the New York Triangle Workshop. So they invited him when he was free to come and work, because they were having a studio, like a building where they were having different spaces to work. So they offered him a space to work there. And it is there David discovered this idea and the importance of a studio. And in the history of South Africa, there were no studios of that sort. Back Factory is another pioneering work by David. So when David experienced the studio, he even reconnected with his old friend, Louis Makubela, who was working in a small space in London, and then introduced him to the artist whom they invited, and they started to share the studio. So again, when he came back to South Africa, he brought the idea of the studio. And that's how Back Factory was formed. Again, these are David ideas. So to speak of pioneers is to speak of these kind of ideas, even when they are executed collaboratively. And again, the Back Factory could not be in place without the support of the likes of Robert Lothar and many others, Ricky Panet, and people who have access to facilities and all of that. So in other words, when we're beginning to rethink or rewrite history, we need to ask whose ideas that manifest, and those ideas must be attributed to their originators. It is that, for me, that is very important about David. So why this is important in the case of this discussion? Because when we think of the project of modernism, whether you read it from the West, from the, by West I mean Europe and North America, or you read it from the Latin Americans, and now with Asia, as well with Africa, as we've heard, they are individuals that begin to work within a project or projects that begin to ask what it is that we need to do in order to be also in conversation with artists around the world, whether through images we make, the kind of medium we make, and the awareness of the shifts. How do we respond to conditions of our presence, but also how do we affect them through the kind of visual expression, the way in which we produce images or representation. So it is that, for me, that becomes important with this project of modernism. And you can trace it. There are many definitions, of modernism, but I don't want to waste time on that. Is that the one that tends to have structured everyone else or the world is this Eurocentric way of thinking about modernism as a reaction to what you call it, the tradition, and is associated with the idea of avant-garde. Whereas for me, I want to think of modernism as an extension or part of what we call it modernity. Right, of course, modernity, it has to do with industrialization, with the rise of technology, urbanization, and so forth. But it's also a consciousness of your time, of your presence, the changing circumstances, and the need to also develop language that moves with your time. By being aware about your time, it is to be a modern subject. And all artists around the world, they do that. Whether they pick up from somewhere in order to change because of the travel they make. So that's why sometimes we waste so much ink trying to define what modernism is. And it is an important project. I enjoy part of what Sylvester, they were discussing earlier, that every context will have its own specificity and demands. But those contexts are not in isolation, because the world has been affected by colonialism in an extent that is hard to talk about what you call it, subject sitting in, and not affecting each other. You know, I mean, that's why the overtold story of Picasso taking from Africa, but also before Picasso took from Africa, he traveled from Spain to France. Even we know when the likes of Paul Gauguin, they were miserable because of the industrialization and all of that. They traveled to Tahiti. You know, not only to enjoy the little girls there that were black, but to learn different ways of painting in terms of color and so forth. And this is not new. Even when we trace how Brunelleschi discovered the linear perspective, he had to leave his country to go somewhere. Even Jacques-Louis David, you know, when he started to inaugurate modern project here in France, he had to travel to Rome to learn different ways of understanding sculpture in terms of painting and all of that. So artists moving and taking from other places is not a new thing. But where it becomes interesting, it's when African or black artists do that they are denied that taking from others. What I would like to call it, the sharing, the exchange, right? So it is this I want to read David does, because when he travels to New York, he discovers the potency, the importance of the workshop. He brings it back to South Africa. That's why the Thupelo. When he comes to London, he works there. He discovers the importance of to have a studio for artists. He brings it. What is in David's mind? Because David comes from those groups in South Africa that were repressed, that were denied, that were living in matchboxes, where there were no space to make art. Hence, most of the early artworks by black artists are small, not because of choice, because of the condition, the confinements of those matchboxes, the lack of space. Hence, also even the material, because artists now they have to compete choices between buying food, paying for rent, sending children to school, as well as buying materials. So in most cases, they recycle and they work with what you call it basic material than buying expensive paintings or inks or crayon or charcoal that, you know, I mean, those who have money, if you just make one stroke with a certain charcoal, everything is there. Instead of working with the crayon that you have to work it in order to create a certain effect. So these are the conditions David preoccupy him. So when he discovered that the idea of the workshop is important, you'll start to see then that by 80s out of this workshop, the scale of the black artist's work start to expand because they're given an opportunity now to work outside. Let me just show some of the images. So that's one of the early pics of the Thupelo, the kind of abstraction. You could see already the resemblance there of the work that was already coming out of America even, and some parts of Europe, you know, especially whether you are thinking of I'm thinking of Colloque or Rothko and many others you can think of. So these are the group of artists that earlier on started the workshop. And the commitment, David, I'm sorry for the poor slide. There is even injured, but still the man commits to go to the workshop on crunches. That's how dedicated he was. So he's the man with the crutches there. So this is the kind of spaces that we use to do workshops. You know, to work outdoors, to find open space buildings, so that there's ample space. Because when you live in a matchbox, you are trapped even in thinking. It takes a lot of work to be imaginative. No wonder those old or the mansion, you know, in which rich people live, they have high ceilings so that they can breathe mentally. So even when they wake up, they can look far. No wonder those who live on the sea border, they can see the horizon, they can imagine what lies at the end where the sky meets the water. So without that possibility, you're blocking people's thinking. So no wonder also Paul Gauguin had to leave France in order to see what was beyond the other side. And it didn't start with them. You remember even Delacroix, they did the same going to Algeria. So what I'm trying to say, when black artists like David do that, sometimes they are not given the credit of being also wanderers. Right, so let me just show more pictures of the space so you can have an idea. As I said, I won't discuss artwork, but just the setting of these spaces. You know what I mean? And one of the things that is not discussed in this spacing, as much as there was an encouragement on focusing on work, but also there was a human contact, human relations that was encouraged. And one of the things David did is to insist on this idea of what has become non-racial or interracial mix. Thupelo was not only for black artists, even though David's interest was to make sure black artists get a stake and also get opportunity to advance and expand, but it was always to kind of cross these boundaries. So that's what Thupelo was, right? So having said that, what now I want to do is to just think of how then to think of Thupelo as a modern project, you know, and I want to do that in two ways, and I've tried to write it so that it makes sense. I've rambled enough. 5 minutes, really. Thanks, Portia. The idea of Thupelo should be thought in terms of future potential. That is to say, you know, I mean, we have to move away from the idea I've said earlier, this common knowledge of a workshop. Because to experiment, to explore, is to discover a new world, but also is to create future. By which I'm asking, what will it take for us to say Thupelo was concerned with imaginative impulses? That is to say also, agentative subjectivity of creative thinkers whose driving purpose is premised on discovering refreshing ways of art making. This is the condition in which I'm thinking of Thupelo as a modernism project. For I'm learning to understand the Thupelo workshop as a condition, of course, taking place under colonial modernity, that offers artists enabling space to explore and discover invigorating itineraries, artistic approaches, whose expressive qualities are as a result of risk, chance, what we might call an unorthodox yet intensive engagement in art making that is also supplemented by dialogues between participating artists, guest art critics, curators, theorists, and historians. Future potentials are also about relevancy, by which I mean the requisite of being tuned with or applicable to particular circumstances that are always changing, and creative thinkers have to either move with the changing circumstances or be ahead to these circumstances. Even better, to prompt the direction these circumstances are moving towards. And this is to affect human perceptions. This is to also create different relations. And for those who have read European art history, we talk about avant-gardes as those who question what has become common or tradition. At the same time, you open up these different avenues. But I'm trying to find other words instead of using this idea of the avant-garde, because it's so exhausted that at times it never makes sense for some of us. So, if we can begin to think Thupelo in this way, what else should we also consider? Thupelo is defined as, it's a Sesotho Setswana word, that is say, you learn by example, right? So it is in this context that when we come together, we learn from each other. By looking at each other, by talking to each other, there's no one instructing no one. We learn from others. Those are the direct translation, but I find them somewhat limited. What I would like also to think about this space in terms of what James Baldwin talks about it as breaking bread. Breaking bread through art making, dialogues, friendship, but a pleasurable and loving critical discourse, one imbued with affective criticality and ethics of caring. For Baldwin, this axiom implies, to quote him, to be sensual, a sensory experience informed by an intellectual integrity, to respect and rejoice in the force of life itself, and to be present in all that one does, from the effort of loving to the breaking of bread. This is what is happening in these workshops. Perhaps that's where we need to begin to think of what this workshop is. And when we do that, we might also stretch the word precisely to think out in terms of the African philosophy, Ubuntu, which means umntu ngumntu ngabantu. A person is a person because of others. So that's what this workshop should be thought about. And that philosophy now has become central in democratic South Africa. And we are asking, to what extent is gifting the world? Right. 2 minutes, right? 1 minute, okay. So thank Poshia. So with that, the last word I would like us to think about Thupelo is also the idea of improvisation, because in those workshops, as I said, chance, accidents, like in the case of musicians who are improvising. What happens when they improvise? Anything can happen. Sometimes you hit a wrong note. Sometimes you strike a curious note, but other musicians respond. We call it, in American expression, call and response. So Thupelo should be seen also in terms of this concept, call and response. Precisely because when we go to those workshops, we are jamming. Those workshops are jamming sessions. And to be modern is to be always improvising, because the conditions are never stable, right? So it is that I would like us to ask what it is about this project that is important. And because of time, then I'll stop there and respond to question and build, any other points I wanted to make. Thank you.
You kept good time. Thank you. I'm going to open up to the floor if there are any questions before because the minister is waiting. Yes, Raphael?
Thank you very much, Thembi. And I'm sure David, because of Thupelo, and many other workshops that then spread around Southern Africa. And I like it when you you talked about improvisation. In 1989, the Pachipangwe workshop that took place at Cyrene Mission was one of those examples of the improvisation that took place, where Bill Ensley, I'm sure on his way back, he then got involved in an accident, and you had the likes of Tafuma Gutsa, who also were part and parcel of that workshop that took place in New York, including William Miko from Zambia. And then Bill Ensley and Robert Loader were also the godfathers of the other workshops that then spreads around the Southern Africa. The Ondambo workshop in Namibia, which was later then called Tulipangwe in Namibia. But what I want to say is that improvisation got to the realization of the elephant dung or cow dung paintings by Chrysophylle at Cyrene Mission. And today, Chrysophylle is celebrated across the globe because of those paintings. And it was that Cyrene Mission, which was through the watchful eye of David Koloane and the Pachipangwe. And I'm sure we talked about the issue of the Pachipangwe archive that is housed at the National Gallery in Bulawayo. And I'm glad to say that the Chrysophylle dung paintings are now owned by the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, but is part and parcel of the Pachipangwe and many other works. But it is important to actually join those dots of the Triangle Arts workshops that are dotted in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in South Africa, and possibly in Botswana, but to see how those archives can also be important to the narrative that you're talking about, the narrative of the role that David Koloane played as a father figure in creating alternative spaces for artists to be able to think beyond and experiment and improvise and come out with something which is very important. I thank you.
That was not a question, was a comment, I suppose. Just to add, as I said, what I didn't mention is this is part of a chapter of a monograph I'm working on David. So as I said, I'm just extracting things. Because you're quite right, Raphael. David, Bill Ainsley, Helen Sibit. In fact, Bill died them coming back from that workshop you mentioned. But the beauty of David, including Bill and Helen and others, because it started with Triangle, and then they extended Triangle to Cape, to South Africa, Johannesburg, which was Thupelo, and they started to move in the southern countries we've mentioned. Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and others. So this is another thing that makes David unique in a way that before that, there hasn't been much interaction across, especially the southern part. So there are these individuals crossing borders at the height of apartheid in the 80s. You know, not only going there to do talk shop, to make art, to speak in their strength, the creative procedures. Again, what this breaking bread I'm interested in as a concept. But not only that, what you need to take into account is that those workshops were not only featuring locals, they also brought international artists. Same thing, Back Factory. You know, they brought international artists. You know what I mean? So you'll have 3 international artists, you know, every 3 months throughout the year. Of course, the other studios are local residents around South Africa. So prior to those 2 workshops, South Africa dependent on what we will call it international at the time, or now we call it global, with institutions such as universities. But of course, there were also other organizations that did a lot of intervention, and Maria can also speak on those in terms of the visual group and others groups that were extending. But in terms of the international reach of art outside of formal institution, Thupelo is one of them. So is Back Factory. When university were there, instead they invited individuals they contain within those. So these are the revolutionary acts in very subtle ways that are important to recognize. You know, I mean, as I said, we can go on. Let me allow people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you. I met David in 2001, but that was in far away Japan. And we didn't talk about his workshop. It was about Western representation of Africa at that time. But it's interesting to get more details about him because unfortunately himself, Colin Richards, we didn't keep in touch for whatever reason. But my question is how, even at the highest level of improvisation, how was this funded? You know, the workshops, how did they get funding? Because I'm sure well, funding is very important, improvisation or not. How did he get funding to run the workshops? And what were the major outcomes in terms of human resource, in terms of work? You know, what kind of artists were admitted, and how did they fare in terms of post-workshop experience and contribution to South African art?
Thank you for that question. I'll mention about 3 minutes. Let's start with Helen Sibiti, whom Portia spoke about. She's also a beneficiary of those workshops. And in fact, if you could trace her work prior to the workshop, she also worked with more kind of landscape, social realism, where women working the field. But the kind of collage images, the distortion, the working of the surface benefited from the workshops in terms of changing the image, if you trace her evolution. Other artists are Sam Hlengetwa, who also benefited from the workshop in terms of the kind of collage that he became known for. So was Keasan, who also from the workshop benefited severely. These are international artists that benefited from the workshop. There's also Petrika Mautlwa, who also benefited from the workshop. You know, I mean, even Mambongi, who didn't reach, there's David working. Mambongi, there's Mambongi with the baby on the back, and there's Petrika Mautlwa on the side, David facing us with his back. So these are artists that benefited, and these are major artists in South Africa today in their different ways. But other artists that benefited from the workshop are Lionel Davis, you know, from Cape Town, I think Raphael mentioned, you know, who also became, you know, really appreciative of the workshop and extended the workshop to Cape Town. There are also other artists that are on the radars, like Garth Erasmus, you can mention. And one of the younger artists that, artist that died younger, Billy Mandindi, for example, who also went to the workshop. I remember when he came back, I was still at the time in high school and still attending CAP classes, when he was just so excited about this idea of throwing paints on canvas and dancing with it. So those are artists that emerge out of this workshop. You know, that's one of the incentives of the workshop. David himself, and what the exhibition did for me, because David produced work and he participated in exhibition, but there's never been a focus on his work, you know, to discuss them. As I was going through his archive, we discovered rolls of canvas that were never seen, that David had been working on. And part of what the workshop did was to incentivize artists not to rely on always buying material, to kind of recycle material or to work with non-conventional material. And the idea of assemblage or collage, which start it was in a developmental stage, but after the Thupelo workshop, you find artists like, as I mentioned, Keasan, by the time he's doing the paper construction, these are benefit of the workshops. As I said, also with Sam Hlengetwa, who also used the workshop in learning just to recycle material. Because when you trace these artists, slowly, okay. So, thank you. So when you look at these artists prior to the workshop, let's take Sam Hlengetwa, take Pat Mautlwa, take Keasan. The three of them, they even Sisbongi, they went to the Rocksreef kind of center, because there they were trained as printmakers, as painters, but again working in these conventional ways of making art. Then from the workshop, their images changes. Whether it moved towards abstraction or it started to explore surfaces or materials that are not those that we always buy, like the paint and the tube and the brush and all of that. So those are the evidence of the workshops. And these will also trickle down to younger artists who benefited later. And you'll find and those artists David have mentored, you start to see the images have these traces. So if we speak of Thupelo as a modernism, it is that project that we still need to start. It's that project I'm starting that you can see, you know what I mean, where it builds on and also where it starts to shift. What I mean by this last, because there have been other moments of kind of modernism in South Africa. I'll just focus on black now. Whether we are talking about for example, the Poly Street, a kind of imagery came out of there around Sydney Kumalo, you know, who work with Cecil Scottness, you know, and David again, even Luma Kubela was part of that. Even prior to that, you can trace those individual, sometimes we call it early pioneers, like the Mangobas, the Sekotos, the Gladys Mkudlandlus, you know, oh, okay, sure. So the Moses were working individually. So there are these different moments. And one of the scholars who have helped us to think of the trajectory of South African modern movement is the late Ndongela Masilela. He talks about the new African movement. you know, but it traces it early to the early missionary trained scholars who began to write. And then later, they start to set up institutions from running presses, some becoming scholars, you know, I mean, from Tiosoga, Jabavu, Dlomo, writing plays and writing criticism. So in other words, it is that when we trace, but I'm just getting around. There are also other satellites, such as Community Arts Project, the FUBA. So back, Thupelo comes late into the picture. It is that I was referring to. So there are these traces. It's just a matter of us, scholars and younger scholars, to begin to make those kind of scholarly write-ups.
Because people are waiting on the other side. Thank you so much. Yeah.